25 million adults and children. That is the number of people believed to be exploited by human trafficking worldwide. As the U.S. State Department releases its annual Trafficking in Persons report, we examine the Trump administration's efforts to protect those vulnerable individuals and hold other governments accountable in the fight against this global problem. Joining me now on Skype is Ambassador John Cotton Richmond, Ambassador at Large to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. Mr. Ambassador, welcome to the show. Great to have you.
Thank you so much.
I know this report is the 20th in a row looking at human trafficking, or as many people refer to it, modern-day slavery. Can you talk about the different types of trafficking and the people who are most at risk?
Absolutely. This is our 20th edition of the Trafficking in Persons report. It was released by the Secretary of State yesterday, and it looks at all forms of trafficking, both sex trafficking as well as forced labor. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act is the statute of the United States that came into force in 2000, same year that we got the UN Protocol against trafficking. And since then, we have seen a major shift around the world as countries are passing laws declaring trafficking to be wrong and trying to help victims.
Ambassador, can you talk about what the victims go through at the hands of traffickers and what type of impact it has on their human dignity?
Well, every victim experience is going to be unique. Everyone's going to respond differently, and traffickers use different types of coercion. Some are physically violent, and others use nonviolent forms of coercion, like manipulation or debt bondage. Some will use threats of reputational harm. Some will use addictive substances and drugs to control people. But one common thing that every victim suffers is the fact that the trafficker is using coercion to take away their freedom. They don't get to make the most basic decisions about their lives, when they wake up in the morning, where they work, or who touches their bodies. And that can create all sorts of trauma and challenges for survivors when they finally are free of their traffickers as they try to deal with that and thrive into their new freedom.
Yeah, and this year also marks the 20th anniversary of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. For people who may not be familiar with it, tell us a little bit about it and the progress that's been made over the last 2 decades.
It was a landmark piece of legislation that really tried to answer this question: how do we stop the way modern traffickers actually operate? And we needed a new law to do that. And since the United States passed that law, we've now seen 154 countries around the world follow suit and pass comprehensive anti-trafficking legislation. It makes sure that all forms of trafficking are criminalized, that is forced labor as well as sex trafficking. It makes sure that we take a victim-centered approach, that we make sure that in all the ways that we do this, we have a rights-based, victim-centered approach to make sure that victims get the care they need. And it ensures that you have to hold traffickers accountable. We can't have situations where traffickers, even if they're convicted, don't suffer any punishment.
Ambassador, was there anything in this year's report that surprised you?
One of the unique things about this year's report is that we got a new piece of legislation that caused us to focus in a new way on state-sanctioned forced labor, where governments have a policy or pattern of trafficking. Normally think about traffickers as criminals or groups or networks, but it is a huge problem when a government itself, instead, who is supposed to and charged with taking care of individuals and keeping them safe from traffickers, becomes the trafficker itself. And where we have state-sanctioned forced labor, we call it out. So the Secretary designated 10 countries around the world as countries that have a policy or pattern of trafficking in persons.
Now, Ambassador, we have less than a minute left, but I'm wondering if you can tell us, I know this is such a huge problem, a global problem, but what can we do as everyday citizens and in our communities to help others in this situation?
I think there's always something that we can do. We can stay informed and understand about the different expressions of trafficking. We can make sure that we're looking for not just typical sex trafficking cases, but also forced labor cases that might be in our communities. We can make sure that we know how to report those cases to hotlines. We can encourage law enforcement officers to take a victim-centered approach and to do proactive investigations. And we can do advocacy around the world to make sure that we are prioritizing this as a nation. Obviously we have COVID right now, and I can tell you traffickers are not shutting down. This is a time where we have to accelerate our efforts.
Ambassador, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking with us about this. Ambassador John Cotton Richmond, Ambassador at Large to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much.